Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our final charla of the series. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Be with Felipe in just a few moments. Thank you all for joining us today. Hello, everyone. Good morning. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. We'll just wait a couple seconds for Felipe to join us. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for tuning in for our final charla of the series as part of Experiments on Stone. Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Can we? Oh, there's Felipe. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Felipe, for joining us. Let's just wait a few minutes, but I'll do my kind of overview, and then Felipe, I'll introduce you, and then we'll get into our conversation. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is the fourth and final iteration of our Charla series as part of Experiments on Stone for women artists from the Tamarind Lithography Workshop. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that from my office here in Phoenix, Arizona, I'm on the traditional territory of the Tohono O'odham. And from the location of the museum in La Jolla in downtown, the museum is seated on the traditional territory of the Kumeyaay. Before we begin anything else, Felipe, let me do a brief bio, and then we'll kind of get into it. Brooklyn-based Felipe Baeza's practice examines themes of memory, migration, and queerness to situate fugitive bodies within a social and historical context of cultural practices. The Guanajuato Mexican-born artist used collages and printmaking techniques to create densely layered paintings that process his personal narrative and transport viewers through past experiences and figures both real and imagined. His work will be included in the 5th iteration of Prospect New Orleans, Yesterday We Said Tomorrow, in fall of 2021. So we're all excited to keep up to see all of that. Baeza earned a BFA from the Cooper Union and an MFA from Yale University. So as I said, we're here chatting a little bit about your work and relationship to some of the artists in Experiments on Stone. For those of you that haven't seen the exhibition, is a digital exhibition that you can see online at mcasd.org/EOS. And it brings together the print practices of Annette Albers, 𝘍𝘰𝘶 Louise Nevelson, and 𝘍𝘵𝘰𝘮, all artists that perhaps we don't associate primarily with printmaking, but created this really interesting body of work at Tamarind, Los Angeles in the 1960s. So it's the first decade of Tamarind. And if we go to the next slide, what's kind of interesting about your work is you have this relationship to two artists, certainly in medium, but then also in personal history, right? So we see someone like Ruth Asawa, who many don't know actually traveled to Mexico. There's this great show, I think it was in Chicago, where they argued that this time that Annette Albers went to Mexico really altered her practice. But then if we even go to the next slide, someone like Annette Albers, who we think of with textiles, but actually just turned into a printmaker after her fellowship at Tamarind. But I think even as a fiber artist, this is an interesting way for us to kind of get into your work and what you're really looking at. So just to briefly mention, I think our strongest connection here is really with Annette Albers, and someone that has constantly been interested in fibers, who again went to Mexico. It shifted her practice and her thinking a lot about how she kind of turned to textiles. So if we go to your work, you started out as a printmaker, right? So you were doing prints at Cooper Union, and you made a lot of these early works which reference kind of pre-Columbian iconography along with others. So I wonder if you can start talking a little bit about your early prints and how you kind of arrived there.
Exactly, yeah. I guess well, thank you for the invitation, Alana, and to the MCA San Diego. And I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge that that here in Brooklyn, in my apartment, I'm in the traditional and unceded land of the Lenape. Um, but yeah, no, I'm quite happy to be in this conversation, but also, you know, in regards to my print body of work and something that I fully immersed myself when I was an undergrad at Cooper Union. And that's, I mean, Cooper Union is not a department-based program. You're able to take anything, but ultimately I decided to just take printmaking my time there. And I mean, I took drawing and painting, you know, but nothing of it spoke to me like printmaking did. You know, I was already drawing and painting, but thinking in a very different way. In regards to also, I guess we could speak about color and how color for me functions very differently as a printmaker, as my first exposure in regards to color. But also, I also a quick note that I also took classes under Nicola Lopez, who was the last speaker.
Yeah.
And Nicola has had a huge influence on my work too, right? And the possibilities of what printmaking can do. And Nicola, as we know, has also done a lot of work at Tamarind. So yeah, I think with the first bodies, you know, in regards to printmaking, I was obviously interested in the history, right? And very much history that these print technologies were used in many ways, right? As a part also of the colonial project, but also in regards to, you know, to this country and also to the country where I was born in Mexico and how it was used, and later on how it was used as a tool to disseminate ideas, right? For in regards to political ideology within the Mexican Revolution, you know, and afterwards used by artists to expand on those ideas of identity. And in regards to that, how this body of work came about in regards to thinking of a queer optic, right? How to work with queer images and how to make queer images, right? In regards to this. And here very much working with an archive and working with Mesoamerican objects. And here also working with, I think at that time I was making collages that were both we're using collage elements from porn magazines and Mesoamerican objects and combining them both in many ways, solidifying that object as a print in many ways.
Yeah, and I think, you know, we spoke about this when we initially talked, but if we go to the next slide, these early prints, because you were making sculptures and installations that kind of relate to each other at this early point. And I think something to really underscore is that you mentioned this idea of the archive, which I think is a really important one when we think about prints, but then certainly you're reusing imagery and how it kind of comes back in and out. And then a couple of points that I want to underscore is your interest in Mexican modernism. When I first saw your work early on, and you know, when we talked, some of the interests that I had, you know, as someone that was interested in modern Mexican photography, of Manuel Alves Bravo, of, you know, and then even into the contemporary period with Graciela Iturbide and looking at the queer body in that way. Is some of your influences as well. And so you're kind of pulling from that, which I think is a really interesting point of connection, that you're looking back at some of these photographers that are really known for solidifying canon in Mexico and then, you know, changing it and pushing it a little bit further.
Yeah, I mean, I think I attach that also to mythology, right? I mean, they're obviously photographs, right? But function very much in very surreal ways to me. Yeah. Obviously, you know, Manuel Alvarez Bravo, Lola Alvarez Bravo, and someone, you know, Graciela Iturbide was sort of my first introduction. I had, you know, like sort of my first memory of a work that has impacted me was an image she took in Juchitán of a mushe called Magnolia, right? And seeing that as a 10-year-old, in many ways, seeing myself in that image and thinking, oh, like this is an other, in many ways, I know this person. Yeah. So that spoke to me in many ways, but also how surreal it was, and then being exposed to, you know, their imagery, their work, and their influences, right? I mean, then that very much could be seen in the work, you know, that to this day, I'm very much responding to those images in many ways.
Yeah, and then if we go to the next slide, which is a nice detail. So this definitely relates to the iconography that we just saw in your earlier print. And for those of you that were in LA, maybe before, was it pre-pandemic, if you saw these earlier prints coupled with the sculptures, it was this really interesting conversation that had with your newer work. And I am curious to hear a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I think it should just be noted that this work was made when I was like 19. That, I mean, not to devalue it, you know, it's work that I that I'm happy I made, you know, that in many ways that pushed me where I am now in many ways. And for the TMR show, the Mistake Room show in LA, it was extremely important to see all this work together, right? Work that expanded from like almost 12 years, in regards to how my practice has shaped and changed, and how in many ways is still grounded in ways of printmaking. But in regards to these prints that we've seen, is a body of work that I had made, you know, when I was still an undergrad. And as I mentioned, it was very much in creating this queer imaginary, like a queer narrative, and very much in distinction to a dominant narrative that doesn't allow space for queer bodies, right? And let alone our desires.
Mm-hmm.
So this very much was about that too. But also be noted that I studied printmaking in a very traditional way, in regards to like making additions, right? So like there was never like a unique piece of work. And Nicola, as I mentioned, was a great influence in seeing how Nicola has pushed this form of printmaking to her own advantage, right? And not really just being fixed to making the additions, but like using what she knows in these tools to expand to like greater installations. And as I mentioned before, I had seen a piece of hers that she had shown that was part of Phantom sightings that came here to New York. And I remember, I mean, I must have been also in like either my early 20s or late teens. And when I saw that work and just being like mind blown, it's like, wow, this is printmaking, right? Like the possibilities of printmaking are endless. So that in many ways, this piece here, I believe its title Fogata was trying to push against like this idea of like pushing pushing against the 2D form and becoming something sculptural. Mm-hmm. Because before Cooper, I had done printmaking, but I was mostly making sculptures. I mean, that's rarely known. I was working with ceramics, and that's rarely known. And there was something about printmaking that spoke to me about like this idea of like, I mean, I guess also we could go into that too. We're like working through layers, right? And my current practice is still very embedded in layers. So like printmaking is very much has impacted the way I'm making to this day. And in regards to this piece, like there's different elements. I'm using silkscreen, I'm using woodcut and monotype, to make this sort of like sculptural object in many ways that exists outside its 2D form.
Yeah, and this is something that I mentioned in our Charla with Nicola, which kind of brings us to the whole impetus of chatting here today. Tamarin, when it initially started in the 60s, was meant to push the medium of printmaking of lithography past, what its historical origins were, right? And so that's why they brought in sculpt Louise Nevelson, who is primarily a sculptor, to kind of move the medium past what it was. And yet it was still very traditional in many ways. And so I do appreciate hearing that, the medium constantly is shifting, in 2020, whatever years later, it's always shifting. It could always be pushed past the medium that it initially starts in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's the sort of misconception of printmaking, that it seems to be such a fixed thing, right? And that's also where I was at, that it's not. It's like if like you have a set of rules and steps, but you could take those to your advantage and create something else. But I think it shouldn't go unnoticed that in regards to the printmaking history in this country, right, and the Renaissance that had happened in the late sort of, I guess, 50s and 60s, that we owe it to women.
Yeah.
In regards, right, that Tamarin was founded by a woman, Gemini was founded by a woman, Universal Unlimited was founded by a woman. So it's like sort of like these women like master printmakers, and in many ways push what we know of the history of printmaking in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's such a great point. And it just reminds me, a brief plug, next week we're going to have a printmaking panel of women in print. So please stay tuned for that. Hopefully we'll get a little bit into that next time. Brief thing before we go on to the next slide, because I think it kind of comes in. You talk about queer bodies, and there, I think in your work, and we'll see it as we go further on, there is this kind of obfuscation of the body, right? The color, that it's hidden, it's concealed. And I think the next slide, we're using a a found image, but we're kind of concealing the bodies here, but with text. And this isn't necessarily queer bodies, but it is fugitive bodies. And so I am curious to hear a little bit more about this.
Yeah, I mean, this is also from my time in undergrad. And I was, in many ways also archiving and collecting these images of these individuals through this sort of middle interstitial space, right? From transportation to one place to the other, and trying to figure out how to work with these images and being sort of conflicted. I think that's also the thing of artists who are working with the archive, is how do you work with the archive without replicating the same systems of violence that made it, right? Like, I don't know who took this picture. I don't know for what reason, right? So I think for me, it was conflict to be like, how do I work with this without replicating that same violence, right? Or either romanticizing something. And for me, it was like, I had used embroidery before in my practice as a drawing making tool, and thinking of like, how do I obscure these images in many ways for them to still carry their agency. But also to speak that like the materials in many ways deal with, eventually work with the context, right? That the hand embroidery is very much in there, is embedded in there, is tied to the work, and that these immigrant anti-immigrant laws are very much bound to these bodies, right? And that they would be persecuted during their time here, so we're bound to these like made up laws of like how we move, how we get to move, how we get to be seen.
So in the embroidered text is a found text, correct, of a sign that was nearby, is that right?
Yeah, a sign that I'm sure to this day is still along the border of the US and Mexico, in many ways just warning people that if they cross, they might be persecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and like the lines of something like that, right? And I think that's also to be said that, whether this piece achieved what I wanted to do, I think in many ways, I'm glad I made this piece, because it's also the first sort of moments where I start to conceptualize this idea of the fugitive body, right? Like, what is the fugitive body? In regards, I also owed a lot to Fred Moten in regards to thinking about fugitivity as someone in many ways that tries to live outside the system, and thinking about like the fugitive, what is the fugitive desire? The fugitive desire is freedom in general, but freedom from the law, freedom from being captured, freedom from regulation, and these were sort of like the first formulating thoughts when I started working with these sort of materials.
Yeah, and I think something that will come up, we'll see further on, is you're interested in embroidery, which you said it really is coupled with the print and the work. It is part of your work, which of course is like this brief look back to someone like Annie Albers, who was like never gave up the idea of thread as part of her work, right? She like incised lines in her prints because she was interested in the idea of embroidery, or of thread rather. If we go to the next slide, this is a great work because the next couple slides will show process. And so I think what's really interesting about these more recent works is that we're looking at this constant layering and the collaging. There's still embroidery, there is a figure, but it is kind of obfuscated by this dark coloring. And I know we mentioned color early on, so perhaps we'll kind of get to it here and a little bit further on. But I am curious what kind of turned you to wanting to start completely doing more figurative work in this way, and the layering and how this kind of evolved.
Yeah, I mean, I think this piece is like maybe 10 years after, or probably more than the last slide. And in regards, well, it's also pushing, all right, well, I have acquired these set of tools, right, that I have with me. And in many ways, I wasn't trying to run away from printmaking, but like running and taking printmaking with me and allowing to make something else, right? So in here, I was in many ways just making collagraphs, which is a process which is kind of like a mixture between, I guess, what one could say between etching and relief, right? When you add sort of textures to a matrix, and eventually you're trying to make tones through these textures. So in here, what happened, there was a process where I had an image of somebody or a drawing that I would eventually erase completely and bring together to a different form. So right here, there's like layers of magazine papers, to a point that it becomes such like a thick piece of paper that has allowed me to either just use a Dremel or carve in or use embroidery in, and thinking about the possibilities I think as the body of being abstracted to a point of illegibility, right?
Mm-hmm.
And thinking in regards to the idea of connection, and also as the fugitive body, but also in regards to migrant bodies, queer bodies, that being legible is a threat to our safety in many ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And thinking about also I guess in regards to the right to opacity in many ways. But what I allowed here is that obviously here that the body, the figure is abstracted and pushed to an extent that the print part allows it to be visible, right? So once this works as a matrix, as a plate, then I'm able to ink it and eventually get a print from it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. So in the next slide, we can kind of see you're pulling the print and using this as a matrix, which I think is really interesting, and I think something that always underscores this idea that printmaking is not static in this way, and that it can contain more things in a stone or anything else like that.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of the fascinating thing about this project, that I mean I made about like 40 prints out of this, and they're all different, right? And that's the thing that not one of them looked the same. They were inked differently, and being able to like add these collage elements that could be seen on the slide, that are now embedded in the prints themselves, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like animating. So it's like when engaged, the plate in many ways becomes visible, right? Because of these sort of tones and dents that are embedded in the actual matrix.
Mm-hmm. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see an actual. This is the print, like kind of pulled matrix. That's
the print, right? So here it's like like the body is now more recognizable in many ways. Like we see the face. Or different aspects, and obviously that has to do with how it was wiped and how it was printed. Mm-hmm. But that was fascinating. I think that's also where it led me to the current body work that I am doing now. That I mean, I'm not necessarily printing these plates, but they could function as plates, and they're built in the same manner, basically.
Mm-hmm. If we go to the next slide. This brings us back kind of to the archive. And so these are, collage elements still, I think, found from magazines, like you said earlier, on top of this kind of pre-Columbian object. And a lot of these cards were really disseminated. It reminds me of like even going back towards, Mexican modernist influences. Someone like Diego Rivera had many of these, right? He had his own museum, right? Because something like this was important to him to constantly like look back. He had his own aims, but I think it is curious to bring back to this idea of mythology and myth making, and how these are even displayed.
Yeah. I mean, this is another project that I have not shown until recently. This was the first time I've shown it was at the Mistake Room, and it's a project that I've been working for maybe the past 4 years. Hmm. And it was something that I would just do in the studio. I mean, I could say that, in the backbone of my practice, I see both printmaking and collage as just the same thing, right? That it's a form that in many ways breaks to unity. And that's how I see them both. But in regards to this project, in regards to working with the archive and thinking, well, it's like, I really have no connection with these objects, right? Like me being born in Mexico means nothing to this project, that it was nothing about it was nothing in regards to be like, oh, I have a connection to these objects. I know what these objects are. And I think for that matter, I was interested because the book itself, it was a book that was published in the 1940s by the Mexican government in regards to this idea of a really problematic project to unify this Mexican identity, right? But also, as you mentioned, these objects, I mean, there are many objects, but specifically these objects were put together in this book as just objects of desire, right? These were the objects to desire, but also in this book itself, all the objects were owned by intellectuals at that time, like Diego Rivera, as you said, owned like a majority of the objects in this book, and which are housed in his museum Anahuacalli in Mexico City. Manuel Álvarez Bravo, also owned a lot of them, and the writers too. But what I was interested in this idea of myth making and this also idea of of anthropology is that it's a problematic field. You know, I'm not an anthropologist in no way whatsoever. But what am I interested in this idea of myth making and how we add a story to an object, right? That in many ways I feel like whether I feel like I was also working as like one could say as the editor in this book, right? That these objects have been taken so much out of context, that these objects have lost their meaning, right? Have been taken from they were from, and in many ways they were never meant to see the light, but now are seen as just desirable objects to own, right? And also like in the many ways they were titled, you know, like Couple and the Act of Love was one, and how they were humanized in very weird ways, but also how they were photographed. And it's like, how do I, in many ways, work with that and thinking, well, you know, pornography functions the same way. You know, pornography, in many ways, the body is fragmented, dismembered in pornography, like specific parts are desired. And the body functions as an object of desire. In many ways, that's also, you know, I was not using pornography, but also using fashion magazines, right?
Right. And
that's to be said that they're printed also, like I was archiving all these images. So they're not, you know, I'm not going online and printing them. And that's good to say, because a lot of the actual bodies in this project are white. Yeah. Right. That's also not having access to, it's like, and thinking how, in regards how these objects have been whitewashed in so many ways. And thinking about that, it's like this project in many ways functions as that.
Yeah, that's incredible. And just, you know, a quick note before we move on, there are several of these, right? There's a body of work that are kind of displayed as, well, at the Mistake Room, they were displayed as cards, in a similar way as to, you know, this book that you're speaking about in the 40s, but then even prior to that, when these objects were kind of disseminated, they were in, as, you know, as we come back to prints, in a small format that could easily be disseminated, right? Because prints are a democratic medium, easily being able to kind of be pushed out in like a postcard format.
True. Yeah. No, I mean, the project itself, I did the whole book. So there are about 50 collages, you know, in this book, and I was able to put the book back together in a book format and doing a small edition of them. To also act as an archive, like now this is what those images are, right? And thinking of the archive and still very much, and I mean, this project in many ways has made other projects possible, right? Right. In regards to thinking of ideas of monstrosity as something powerful, or this like half and half idea, you know, that obviously in Gloria Anzaldúa talked about, you know, this being both men and women. And I think it's with that is that, you know, that a lot of also the prints that I had done before came from actual collages like this. They started as collages, then transformed into a relief, you know, being transferred to a plate.
Great. Okay, let's move on to a new work. Well, it's not super new, but this is now in LACMA's collection, so we've seen it a lot lately. And it is a found map, but there are bodies kind of embroidered on top of this, and it's been continually collaged, right? This is a continuing theme for you and your work. And so I am curious to hear a little bit about how you arrived to a map, because I think when we, especially, you know, talking about fugitive bodies, but then certainly I think the United States and the map means something so intense sometimes. So I am curious to hear a little bit more about this.
Yeah, well, interesting story. I mean, this is a map that I had found, like I've acquired so many things. This is also a map that I found when I was an undergrad. Okay. On the side of on the street in New York. And it's a map that for a reason I just had like carry with me, you know, wherever I moved. And as you mentioned, you know, it's not like I put it up in my room at all. I think it was just an interest, like what this map means to me, right? As a person who has dealt with, like I just having a very hard relationship with this country, right? And I guess when we talk about progress in this country, in this empire known as the United States, there are groups that are in many ways are always left out, you know. Right. and we've seen this maybe, and we can speak to the last month. We don't have to speak to the last 20 years, you know, in regards to obviously those groups obviously being Black people, working class people, migrants, and through this piece, you know, entitled "So Much Darkness, So Much Brownness," and through my art practice, you know, I think I aim to challenge those notions that keep people in the margins, right? I believe that art has a crucial role to play in transforming and redefining and like reimagining the global phenomenon of migration, right? And and also like the stories that come out of migration, right? That very much are focused on criminality and punishment. But also to this piece, in relation to this piece, this is also like a breakthrough in my practice in many ways, right? Because I was in many ways still in this sort of print mentality of printing, and the end project from this piece was the print of the piece.
Right.
So I built this in many ways. I mean, it's hard to see here because I was also dealing with the same issue I had with the early piece with the embroider sign. There's actually an embroider aspect of the work that has like 5 individuals crossing a border that is hand sewn onto the actual map. And then onto the map itself, you have every state outlined by twine. And then there's layers and layers of pigments, right? So this process that, you know, in many ways I was trying to not rely on the press, and my studio itself became the press, the floor became the press. So I was constantly just making monotypes in many ways. So putting dry pigments and water on the floor, and then laying this map over, peeling it back and forth until, you know, you have all these layers of pigments and metallic powders attaching to the paper, and in many ways pushing those figures, you know, to this point of illegibility, right?
Yeah, and this idea of the studio becomes your floor becomes the studio is something that I think we'll get into in a little bit. But because I know pieces of the studio become integrated into new works like skin and things like that we'll see in later work. So I just want to reminding myself that we'll definitely get there. So we go to the next slide. So this is, we're still seeing embroidery, but then we're seeing, you know, a non-hidden figure. So I hope you can speak a little bit about this and your decision to show the figure in this way.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still showing the figure, but I think in many ways, it's, you know, I think the process itself dictates my color palette in many ways. But also interested that, you know, sometimes in the work, the figure might be visible, but kind of blending in with the background. And obviously thinking in regards to how the space is dictated within a piece, right? Within like this one, for instance, the body itself functions as the space, as the ground, as the land, and thinking of as this is another work in many ways where I started this idea of like thinking of the ideas of regeneration, the body giving life to something else, that the body in many ways is still in the land, whether it's not here physically. But also in regards to that, thinking in many ways of those that are no longer with us, right? Like we're here in this conversation because someone is missing, right? But thinking also about those that in many ways didn't make it through this sort of middle process of coming from and going to another place, right? That those histories are thriving within us through different forms.
Yeah, and if we go to the next slide, this idea of regeneration is something that is, I think, really interesting in this slide because, you know, we see a part of a hand, but then it's a little difficult to see, but this is really textured arm here, right? And I think that brings us back to your studio is kind of, your floor is used as a studio, that there are pieces of paper that are then used and reintegrated on top of the work over and over to create these textured looks.
Yeah, I mean, the work in many ways recycles itself constantly. Like I'm making pieces right now that probably contain pieces from like 5 years ago, right? But also that this sort of history of the work, it's still embedded in the floor. So I'm constantly the work is picking up histories from other pieces. But also that in many ways I've like encountered a process that has allowed me to this like endless giving, right? That I'm able constantly to use these elements for future projects. But itself, this project itself is made that way too. The background, like going back to how layers work in the work, and very much that is coming from my printmaking mentality and history that I work in layers. And so like the background gets done first through this printmaking process, which I spoke about, that deals with the floor. This is basically like where the painting happens, and then eventually the drawing happens, which is the twine that gets attached to the paper itself, and then layers of paper and sanding back and forth, and then here the hand element is made of combined different sort of mosaic paper pieces put together coming from other projects.
Yeah, and so I think there is something really kind of poetic about this. There's like this regeneration of, certainly in the iconography, but then there is your earlier projects still make its way into later projects, and then it kind of this evolution in that way, which I think is really beautiful.
Yeah. I mean, I think this must have been from 2016, and this idea, I'm using embroidery again, but I'm kind of using it as not just as a drawing tool, but as a tool in many ways to in regards to to react to the space, right? So if you're close with the piece, these threads will move around because of your breath. So there's like this sort of reaction to the body that I'm interested, or reaction to the space itself. If it's, if there's like wind or air, the piece is actually activating itself. But it also functions in many ways, for older pieces, the embroidery itself worked as a way to defer the gaze.
If we go to the next slide, we go back to the color that you were talking about. And these it looks a little purplish, but they are blue. And so it brings us to, Mayan blue. And if we go to the next slide, there's a detail, which is a little purple, but I promise it's blue. But these are two men embracing, and I want to kind of talk through a little bit more about these, the sheer size of the blue works, but the color blue, certainly, as Mayan blue is this kind of everlasting pigment that was meant to, certainly I think there's artists now thinking of this idea of resiliency. Mayan blue really means something to Latinx artists, communities, etc. But then also this visibility idea that we kind of talk through.
Yeah, well, these pieces, it came obviously going back, and I'm always working with the archive, right, and responding to the archive, and I think the map itself was the last time I work with a specific image that is actually used in the work itself. And I said it because in this piece, it came from me coming across this image of a drawing, and a cave drawing that's in the border of Guatemala and Belize, of two Mayan men embracing each other, and thinking, how queer that was to see that, right? But also beyond that, thinking that we rarely get to see queer moments of intimacy. And I mean, it's hard to see, and I think that for us, and I'm glad that it's hard to see, because that was sort of the point of these pieces in this series, was thinking of this idea of invisibility, right? The right not to be seen, the right not to be counted, where one could assume that these are just monochromatic paintings in many ways, but once you're spending time with them, they start to reveal themselves. They start to reveal themselves slowly. And going back to this idea, it's like I think I'm like with these pieces, and for a lot of my practice and my work is like to foreground sort of that rupture, that fragmentariness that I'm interested, but also in many ways, like this work, like creating other modes of being, and that those modes of being is like not being always visible, like as I mentioned, in many ways, as a queer person, but as a migrant, we have seen that visibility is a trap, for a lot of us, and for a lot of our safeties. And how do we, in many ways, thrive under that invisibility? Like, I don't want to romanticize, yes, I want to be in this state forever, but for a lot of us, that's the only state we're in. And to that state is how does one navigate that state and create in many ways, a state of survival?
Right. Yeah, and then we talked about when we were talking before this, the size. So these are quite large. If you go back quickly, Chris, back one slide, um, these are quite large, and we talked about because some of your work are more intimately scaled, right? To reference retablos and things like that. And so these are at a much larger scale. The figure becomes almost monolithic, right, in front of us. And so I want to talk about that and your decision for this large format. When we spoke, it was kind of, you were interested in the idea of portable murals and its legacy. And so I'm curious to hear about this.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, size happened for many reasons, just having the space to make larger work.
Yeah.
But also the power to see these bodies bigger than you was also powerful for me to experience and to make. But also how they function, right? That I think, obviously, being very much interested in the history of muralists in Mexico and what that did, but also the power that had too, right? To see sort of a history or a mythology implemented on a wall. But also that, later, as those became portable, so there are portable murals that I also was interested in this idea of like that these could like move around. But also that they function like tapestries, right? That I very much like that when they're shown, they function like that, like that I'm not trying to hide that these are on paper, paper in many ways. Also this idea that I enjoy working on paper, and paper just needs to do what paper needs to do when it's in contact with water, that these in many ways function as skin. So to see that at the scale in many ways, not to say like it's a spectacle, but I think it was important for me to see the works. Right now I'm working at a smaller scale, and for me that just is extremely comfortable. It's like, I mean, for me, working on a 16 by 20 piece like 10 years ago was like, no way. It's unimaginable. But to see this at a larger scale and being able to do that and be able to have the space to do that as an option has been sort of liberatory.
Yeah. And then we have, I think, a couple more slides. Chris, if we go up 2 slides. So this is a more modest scaled work, but this is more of your newer work. And so I'm curious to hear a little bit more about this. I know it's much more textured from what we've seen previously. And so the process in this, I think, is much like the same, except for now the effects are, I think, when I'm in front of these works, I have to spend a lot of time with them because I think there is all of these textures, this work that it really kind of goes into it. It's really difficult to capture here. But I think, as you said earlier, which is kind of a good thing, right? It forces the image to kind of reveal itself to us in over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also good to know that, I also like this idea with scale, right? That sometimes for me, the smaller work has much of a greater impact, right? Like, I mean, this piece itself, I mean, this is 8 by 10, it's a small piece. And the impact that for me it's had than larger pieces, I feel like the scale in many ways could do so many things in regards to that too, that, it could be a smaller piece, but have such a huge impact. But same with that, thinking of with this piece and pushing it, I was thinking about ideas of fugitivity, but now sort of pushing that forward into modes of suspension, right? And that's also good to note that has been allowed to in many ways, that reading has also impacted the work in many ways. It's I think something that we should say in this talk. And at this moment I'm reading 𝘍𝘰𝘶𝘳 𝘞𝘰𝘮𝘳 Unruly Visions, and she speaks about these ideas of suspension, right? That in many ways queer and migrants are put in many ways in these ideas of suspension with no path to normative success, right? But in this mode of suspension, one is able to create modes of survival, right? Which I have learned, as someone who has dealt with, in many ways, illegality in this country, and how does one survive, right? And very much with the work is this idea of like pushing against the demand to be visible, as I mentioned, but also pushing against the demand to be legible in ways that the state demands, right? So it's like, this idea of like that a lot that I'm thinking about is like, how do I, live outside, um, inside
Yeah.
these laws, right? And that has changed over time. It's like, I think I speak about it a lot. It's like, what is it to desire something that doesn't desire you? And to be more specific, is citizenship, right? How like to this point, it's like, I have no desire for citizenship. I think I've been here since I was 7. I'm 33 now. But that has changed over time. I think and I think the work in many ways has allowed that language to come through, and thinking about like, how does one think outside these constructs, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think something that we mentioned when we spoke, this idea of legibility on one's own terms, right? Because I think now we're in this hyper moment where these issues are hyper present, and yet for often the wrong reasons, right? So it is to kind of check a check mark or to do things like that. And I think what's really interesting is this idea of being legible on one's own terms. And I think what we've seen through your work is this idea of one working through the idea of it is a trap to be legible, and yet like now I can be legible in my own way,
Exactly. I think that's so true. But I think another thing is like, citizenship, it won't protect us, and we know that. uh, um, and for that reason, I think, 𝘍𝘰𝘶 𝘍𝘰𝘮 and her writing, but also someone else who has been extremely influential has been 𝘧𝘳𝘰𝘮𝘳𝘪𝘮 𝘍𝘰𝘮, right? And thinking about these ideas of incompleteness, right? To value that that difference, that incompleteness, right? And that's something that I value, that as someone in many ways, I guess what I'm trying to say is like, how does one reclaim sort of like a queer futurity in many ways, and that it's like valuing sort of difference over sameness in many ways, and resisting assimilation, and embracing that incompleteness, as I mentioned, right? I think, and that's what I like about queerness, that it's such an incomplete project, and that it will forever be incomplete, right? And that's how, I feel like we've had this conversation before, and that's how I feel like the sort of new project, as I see it, Latinx is a project that will never be complete.
Indeed. And I think it's an ongoing question, concern, topic for panel discussions, Latina, absolutely. But if you go to the next slide, I think this is our last slide. And this was a newer work for also shown at the Mistake Room, quite large. So what people aren't entirely seeing, there are like these kind of lines, and those are sizes of bricks. So it was quite large. It took up the back wall, I think, of the installation. So again, you're working on paper at this kind of monumental scale, and it was a focal point. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about how this kind of came to be.
Yeah, thinking of more of working in this monumental scale, obviously having not just the space to make it, but the space to share it, right? And thinking about going bigger and pushing my body in many ways to make this happen, and seeing sort of like, in many ways, the work has changed, and as we've seen in regards to how the work is structured, is that usually there's just one figure or individual, right? And for me, space hasn't been of an importance, because for me, like, the body is a space. The body is basically the part that I'm interested in many ways of exploring, of a space of in regards to not just to belonging, but here in this space is like pushing that in many ways forward. And these ideas, I guess it speaks to both ideas of regeneration, but also fugitivity and land, right?
Mm-hmm.
And seeing this more as in regards to the other work, seeing this more as a mural,
right?
In many ways.
Yeah, I do think it does function as a mural, and I think the idea of like portability of this work to be shown in different contexts, what the idea of land means when it's shown in different contexts, it's really interesting, and I think something that we all should ruminate on, like what happens when a work is kind of transported into different ways, especially something like this, which is currently always my interest, but certainly when we talk about the history of portable murals, when that happened, what that meant And so I do think that something like this is really interesting in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I think I also say that, in regards to this work and what I'm making now is in this sort of exploration of the effects of displacement, right? And the ways, in many ways, the human body is remade in order to survive, right? And with that is like the possibilities for queer futures that are very much anchored in the past, and I think that's what I'm making, and how the body in many ways has changed, right? That the bodies I'm making now in many ways sit in this sort of in-between space in regards to gender. And that's
Mm-hmm.
where sort of like I want to push forward with these bodies that, as we saw, collage in many ways functions very differently because I'm able to do very different things and than the larger pieces, right? That I'm now working with actual printed media. But in
Right.
many ways, it's coming from an extension from printed media. So a lot of the actual sort of, I wouldn't say sketches, because they're collages, are actually these printed media that then are transformed to these images.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that is a great place for us to take questions. I saw one early because now we don't have a Q&A box. But it was about, Chris, I don't entirely remember your question, I'm sorry. But it was about the earlier works, and she asked if someone like 𝘍𝘰𝘶𝘳 and the earlier kind of postcard collage, 𝘍𝘰𝘶 and I can't remember the other one, Chris, sorry, also had work like that. Is this something that you were you looking at 𝘍𝘰𝘶𝘳 and others besides, 𝘧𝘬𝘮𝘰𝘮 or someone like that when you're 𝘍𝘰𝘶𝘳, thank you. When you were making this body of work?
Yes, but I think they were using those objects in a very different way than I was, right?
Right.
I think in many ways, I don't want to speak on behalf of them, but I think it was a very, I think what I'm just trying to say is a very different connection to that work, right? Than I had. Yes, yeah, I was born in Mexico. I left at a young age. I have a very different relationship to that. And in no way is about me decolonizing and trying to connect with these objects, because as we know, indigeneity in Mexico, in many ways has, unlike this country, where it's not that it's happened a long time ago, but, I mean by that I mean that there's such an erasure that happened, right? So I'm not able to connect sort of my history to a specific ancestor in regards to that, right? And that's
Right.
what this wasn't a long time ago. It's like speaking to my grandmother. Her father spoke a dialect, and
Yeah.
she doesn't know which dialect it was. Like, that history is not a long time ago. But I think in many ways it's just reacting to these objects and how they're used and how in many ways they're being shown and how their meanings have changed over time. And we've seen that through history in Mexico, right? With like 𝘍𝘰𝘶𝘳 and 𝘍𝘰𝘶𝘳, and how she was in many ways, her meaning has changed over time, like from monster to a masterpiece. It's like
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I think that's so true. And I think the co-opting of like Tualac and 𝘍𝘰𝘶𝘳 and how that has like shifted, right? So now the monoliths were only found in in the 60s. So it is
exactly, yeah.
interesting. Yeah, of course. I don't think we have any other questions, but if you all think of them, which always happens to me after a talk, feel free to email the museum, DM the museum with any questions, and we'll try to kind of get those to you. Keep up with Felipe and his work. We're really excited to see what happens in the fall with your new work. Prospect New Orleans. It's really exciting, especially after, now that COVID is more manageable. It'll be nice to hopefully that some of us can travel to see this. And if, keep up with what we're doing at the museum. As I said, next week there will be a panel on printmaking and women in diversity and prints overall. And so please join us there. Register at event links, and yeah, thank you, Felipe. This was lovely, and for your generous answers and time for everything.
No, thank you, Alana. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's always great to see you, even in this platform.
It's great to see you. Hopefully we can see each other in person soon.
Yes, no, and thank you for everyone who joined us.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, everyone, have a great great morning. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.